Week 2, day 2. How are we? Again, I wish I could just have a conversation with you, but that's okay. So the bombs went off, right? Bomb went off in a flash. Like it was so fast. He says, yeah, just that one sentence. And the war began and ended in that instant. The jets had sighted their target, alerted their bombardier at 5,000 miles an hour. Okay, you go 5,000 miles in an hour. I think it's 2,000 miles to California, so be a half an hour to get to California, half an hour to get back. Pretty good. No. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so he's thinking of Mildred now. Get out! Run! He saw her in her hotel room, somewhere now in the half second remaining, with the bombs, a yard, a foot, an inch from her building. He saw her leaning toward the great shimmering walls of color and motion, where the family talked and talked and talked to her, where the family prattled and chatted and said her name and smiled at her and said nothing of the bomb that was an inch, now a half inch, now a quarter inch from the top of the hotel, leaning into the wall as if all the hunger of looking would find the secret of her sleepless unease there. Mildred leaning anxiously, nervously, as if to plunge, drop, fall into that swarming immensity of color, to drown in its bright happiness. Woo! Again, apologize that I'm stopping, but have you guys ever felt this before? Because I know I have. I'm thinking of my phone, but leaning into the wall as if all the hunger of looking would find the secret of her sleepless unease there. Just sometimes you're like, I'll find the thing! I'll find the thing! Sleepless unease. Okay, fall into that swarming immensity of color to drown in its bright happiness. The first bomb struck. Mildred! Perhaps, who would ever know? Perhaps the great broadcasting stations with their beams of color and light and talk and chatter went first into oblivion. Montag falling flat, going down, saw or felt or imagined, he saw or felt the walls go dark in Millie's face, heard her screaming, because in the millionth part of time left, she saw her own face reflected there, in a mirror instead of a crystal ball, and it was such a wildly empty face, all by itself in the room, touching nothing, starved and eating of itself, that at last she recognized it as her own, and looked quickly up at the ceiling as it and the entire structure of the hotel blasted down upon her, carrying her with 1,000,000 pounds of brick, metal, plaster, and wood, to meet other people in the hives below, all on their quick way down to the cellar where the explosion rid itself of them in its own unreasonable way. I remember. Montag clung to the earth. I remember. Chicago. Chicago a long time ago. Millie and I, that's where we met. I remember now. Chicago a long time ago. The concussion knocked the air across and down the river, turned the men over like dominoes in a line, blew the water in lifting sprays, and blew the dust and made the trees above them mourn with the great wind passing away south. Montag crushed himself down, squeezing himself small, eyes tight. He blinked once, and in that instant saw the city instead of the bombs in the air. They had displaced each other. For another of those impossible instants, the city stood, rebuilt and unrecognizable, taller than it had ever hoped or strived to be, taller than man had built it, erected at last in gouts of shattered concrete and sparkles of torn metal into a mural hung like a reversed avalanche, 1,000,000 colors, 1,000,000 oddities, a door where a window should be, a top for a bottom, a side for a back. And then the city rolled over and fell down dead. The sound of its death came after. Okay, what do Montag's imaginings about Mildred's fate when the bombs fall indicate about him? So, right, he imagined Mildred, she's like staring at the TV, right? And talking with her family, going, beep, 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 doo, family, woo, just like, hey, how's it going? And then, right before the bomb hits, like a quarter of an inch before the bomb hits, the screens go black, and he's imagining her just staring at her face, and just seeing in a mirror instead of a crystal ball. And it was such a wildly empty face, all by itself in the room, touching nothing, starved and eating of itself, and she recognized it as her own, and looked quickly up at the ceiling, and its entire structure of the hotel blasted down. So he's imagining Millie in her last minutes, seeing her own face and seeing how, like, there was just nothing going on in there. What does that indicate about Montag? Because it's Montag's imagination, right? What does that show? What does that tell us about Montag as a character? About his personality? Give me a sentence. Montag lying there, eyes gritted shut with dust, a fine wet cement of dust in his now shut mouth, gasping and crying, now thought again, I remember something else. What is it? Yes, part of Ecclesiastes. Part of Ecclesiastes and Revelation. Part of that book. Part of it. Quick now, quick before it goes away. Before the shock wears off. Before the wind dies. Book of Ecclesiastes. Here. He said it, and just so you know, the book of Ecclesiastes, it's a book in the Bible. He said it over to himself silently, lying flat to the trembling earth. He said the words of it many times, and they were perfect without trying, and there was no Denham's dentifrice anywhere. It was just the preacher by himself, standing there in his mind, looking at him. There, said a voice. The men lay gasping like fish laid out on the grass. They held to the earth as children hold to familiar things, no matter how cold or dead, no matter what has happened or will happen. Their fingers were clawed into the dirt, and they were all shouting to keep their eardrums from bursting, to keep their sanity from bursting, mouths open. Montag shouting with them, a protest against the wind that ripped their faces and tore at their lips, making their noses bleed. Montag watched the great dust settle, and the great silence move down upon their world. And lying there, it seemed that he saw every single grain of dust and every blade of grass, and that he heard every cry and shout and whisper going up in the world now. Ooh. It's what? Silence fell down in the sifting dust, and all the leisure they might need to look around, to gather the reality of this day into their senses. Montag, look. Okay, no, we're going to do it. I want you to do a reflective question right now. So there's this quote here, silence fell down in the sifting dust, and all the leisure they might need to look around, to gather the reality of this day into their senses. So we've got some leisure time, right? And slowly we're kind of looking around and being like, whoa, this is different. And I want you to do just a little 3 sentences, 4 sentences right now about about how that's going on. So as we're like gaining our senses as to like kind of what's happening, like how is that going for you? Just staying inside, like knowing there's, knowing you just gotta be inside. Give me 3 to 4 sentences. You can pause it. And then I'm going to keep going. Montag looked at the river. Oh, unless there's questions. Nope. We'll go on the river. He looked at the old railroad tracks. Or we'll go that way. Or we'll walk on the highways now, and we'll have time to put things into ourselves. And someday, after it sets in us a long time, it'll come out our hands and our mouths. And a lot of it will be wrong, but just enough of it will be right. We'll just start walking today and see the world. And the way the world walks around and talks, the way it really looks. I want to see everything now. And while none of it will be me when it goes in, after a while it'll all gather together inside, and it'll be me. Look at the world out there, my God, look at it out there, outside me, out there beyond my face. And the only way to really touch it is to put it where it's finally me, where it's in the blood, where it pumps around 1,000 times, 10,000 a day. I'll get hold of it so it'll never run off. I'll hold on to the world tight someday. I've got one finger on it now. That's a beginning. The wind died. The other men lay a while on the dawn edge of sleep, not yet ready to rise up and begin the day's obligations. Its fires and foods, its 1,000 details of putting foot after foot and hand after hand. They lay blinking their dusty eyelids. You could hear them breathing fast, then slower, then slow. Montag sat up. He did not move any farther, however. The other men did likewise. The sun was touching the black horizon with a faint red tip. The air was cold and smelled of a coming rain. Silently, Granger arose, felt of his arms and legs, swearing incessantly under his breath, tears dripping from his face. He shuffled down to the river to look upstream. It's flat, he said a long time later. City looks like a heap of baking powder. It's gone. And a long time after that. I wonder how many knew it was coming. I wonder how many were surprised. And across the world, thought Montag, how many other cities dead. And here in our country, how many? 100? 1,000? Someone struck a match and touched it to a piece of dry paper taken from their pocket, and shoved this under a bit of grass and leaves, and after a while added tiny twigs, which were wet and sputtered, but finally caught. And the fire grew larger in the early morning as the sun came up, and the men slowly turned from looking upriver, and were drawn to the fire, awkwardly, with nothing to say. And the sun colored the back of their necks as they bent down. Granger unfolded an oilskin with some bacon in it. We'll have a bite, then we'll turn around and walk upstream. They'll be needing us up that way. Someone produced a small frying pan, and the bacon went into it, and the frying pan was set on the river. After a moment, the bacon began to flutter and dance in the pan, and the sputter of it filled the morning air with its aroma. The men watched this ritual silently. Granger looked into the fire. Phoenix. What? There was a silly damn bird called a phoenix back before Christ. Every few hundred years he built a pyre and burned himself up. He must have been first cousin to man. But every time he burnt himself up, he sprang out of the ashes. He got himself born all over again. And it looks like we're doing the same thing, over and over. But we've got one damn thing the phoenix never had. We know the damn silly thing we just did. We know all the damn silly things we've done for 1,000 years, and as long as we know that, and always have it around where we can see it, someday we'll stop making the goddamn funeral pyres and jumping in the middle of them. We pick up a few more people that remember every generation. You guys heard of the Phoenix before? So it's in Harry Potter, and that's what I remember. But the Phoenix was this magical bird that and he's saying, and I never had heard it this way before, but I know of the Phoenix that when the Phoenix dies, it like burns up, and then it is reborn from its own ashes. And he's saying that the Phoenix would build a pyre, so build like a big not a campfire, but build like a whole fire. It's a pyre, like build like probably with a lot of pallets, and would go into the fire, and then he would get reborn from the ashes. And the question is, what makes humans different from the Phoenix, right? What does he say? Because he talks about how the Phoenix, right, just does it. And he's saying how man does the same thing, right? We just like jump into the fire and then we're reborn again. We're just like the Phoenix, except I'm going to read the line just in case. And it looks like we're doing the same thing over and over, but we've got one damn thing the Phoenix never had. We know the damn silly thing we just did. We know all the damn silly things we've done for 1,000 years, and as long as we know that and always have it around where we can see it, someday we'll stop making the goddamn funeral pyres and jumping in the middle of them. We pick up a few more people that remember every generation. All right, and we're gonna end that for today, guys. Thank you. We've got 3 pages left, 2.5, not even. Very excited. All right, peace.